Chapter 7. Refuge from the Storm. The stars were still shining faintly as the sky grew brighter. Everyone in the house gathered all the things each could safely carry. Abraham kept listening for the dragoons to return, but the family need not have worried. Though few in the town knew, all the soldiers regularly slept soundly at this time of morning. "Now remember, children," said Mother calmly, "we only need the things we use every day. Lord willing, we will return from Uncle Philippe's farm in a month or soon after the dragoons move on." Albert and Renee stepped out the back door to shake some breadcrumbs out of a light blue tablecloth. Their chattering went silent. Time was short that morning, as everyone hurried about, and when the girls didn't return quickly, Mother grew impatient. "Girls, come back inside. We have work to do," said Mother as she stepped out back, glancing around. There they sat, trying to hold back their tears and be big girls. But tears trickled down their dresses into the trampled flowers and vegetables that had once been their gardens. Carrots and onions and turnips had been kicked out of the ground and smashed into pieces. Last night, when the dragoons came, they and their horses had plowed their big, uncaring boots and hooves in and out, over and over, all through the girls' work. The horses had chewed up the vegetables that they hadn't crushed. Renee and Albert stared at their once healthy poppies whose petals lay twisted and pressed into the earth. But the sisters didn't make a sound. They just sat in silence, missing the work of their hands. Their gardens had taken so long and seemed to require so much work and love. They didn't notice Mother. She came behind them and gently pulled them up by their arms. She turned them around and held their little chins in her warm hands, staring into their eyes. Holding back her own tears for her children, she whispered, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Looking down, they nodded. "Lord willing, we will start a new garden next year," said Mother. They would have to wait for next year because this was now harvest time and the fall season was soon upon them. Mother moved them back inside. Time was running out. Father had quickly run over to Pastor DeLune's home as sunshine appeared over the horizon. Pastor DeLune had already been out helping another family that had been forced to give shelter to a band of dragoons the previous night, and he had been on his way to the Martineau's house, having heard their news. Father met him in the street and told him they were planning to move out to Uncle Philippe's farm for a while, until the dragoons moved on. Pastor DeLune agreed and said that several other families were moving out of town for a while as well. When Father returned to the house, 2 elders from the church were there helping to get the family's things in order. They offered to carry bags out to the farm, but Father and Abraham said they would be able to carry the bags without trouble. The son of one of the elders started out to Uncle Philippe's farm to tell him of the Martineau's trouble. As the Martineaus started down the muddy road, Monsieur Rubiquet watched them from his window, thinking that they should have left earlier. Father nodded another thank you to him, and they were off. More clouds were starting to gather overhead, and the fog still divided the sunlight. To avoid attracting more attention, Father decided that the family should separate into smaller groups and meet again outside the city walls. Renee and Albert each carried a blanket, and they took turns holding the rope attached to Bouclé. Mary carried Phoebe, and Mother carried Guillaume, sometimes letting him walk a ways. Father and Abraham each carried 2 large sacks of the family belongings. Soon they all met outside the town and started following the long, winding, muddy roads to Uncle Philippe's farm. They passed by rain-swelled creeks and a few smaller vineyards glistening in the remaining sunshine. After about an hour of walking through the sucking mud, they stopped. No dragoons had followed them or had even known of their leaving town. They sat on an old, broken stone wall a short way from the road and rested. Mother fed Phoebe, and Guillaume explored the wall, smacking it here and there. Bouclé was tired too, but no one would carry him. Everyone's shoes, stockings, and feet were soaked through with mud, as were the hems of the twins' dresses. After Phoebe was ready to go, Father and Abraham stood up with their bags again and started slogging along the road. Abraham was sure that the farm couldn't be much farther now. The rain clouds had continued to gather all morning, and after walking a few more hills, the rain started to fall. It started lightly at first, and then grew harder and harder. They all moved off the road quite a way and found some cover from the rain under a huge old tree. The pounding rain didn't stop for a long time. As they waited, they could hear the sounds of a horse and wagon nearing them. Thinking that it might be more dragoons, they pressed themselves out of sight around the tree. Father and Abraham watched carefully. The rain muffled the sound. Abraham watched the road as the water dripped off the brim and his hat in front of his eyes, but then he turned and glanced up the road in the direction they were heading. There it was! Uncle Philippe and the elder's son were racing down the muddy road toward town, but the Martineaus could not be seen or heard from where they were hiding, so Abraham dropped his bags, called out, and started running toward the road, waving his hands. The steady rain muffled his cries. Uncle Philippe rushed on by with his wagon. Abraham, now at the road, kept running after him and shouting. Barely hearing something, the elder's son riding with Uncle Philippe glanced behind him and saw a soaked Abraham waving his arms, getting farther and farther behind the wagon. Father was behind Abraham now as well. Soon the horse and wagon had turned around and pulled up the road to the waiting Martineaus. That was a close one, laughed Uncle Philippe. He slapped his knees with his wide, strong farm hands, and his whole wide red face and bald head seemed to smile. As soon as I heard the news, I started out for you. Mother hugged him, and he and Father helped everyone get into the back of the wagon. They covered themselves with blankets. The elder's son bid them all farewell and started off, running back to his home in town. Everyone thanked him heartily. The ride in the wagon seemed longer than usual, and the rain never let up. But finally Uncle Philippe, with Father sitting next to him, directed the horse off the main road down another, smaller path. Albert and Renee were now sitting up, uncovered, and could see the farmhouse's warm candle lights sparkling through some trees. "We're here," they said slowly, and all the others pulled off their blankets and looked around. Uncle Philippe pulled into the stable, and Aunt Catherine and her 4 daughters came running out to meet them. Hugs and kisses were everywhere. "You are all so soaked," said Aunt Catherine. Hurry inside. We have dry clothes and a big warm fire for you." 3 of Uncle Philippe's and Aunt Catherine's daughters, Marthe, Sarah, and Jeanette, were close in age to Albert and Renee. The oldest cousin, Elizabeth, was a little older than Mary. All 4 cousins had bright, rosy cheeks and sunshine brown faces from being out on the farm. All were blonde as their father, Uncle Philippe, had once been when he had hair. All the youngest girls bounced inside, happy to be out of the rain. Soon everyone was in dry, warm clothes, all cozy around a large stone fireplace. The whole house had a floor made from wide, smooth stones. This home was much larger than the Martineaus' home. In the farmhouse, they all sat in the big main room, the fire room, at the center and back of the house. To the front of it sat the cooking and eating area. From both sides of the cooking area and the fire room were doors leading to 2 rooms on each side. Normally the cousins would sleep on one side and the parents in the other, but now, with the Martineaus here, the cousins moved to their parents' side of the house, and all the Martineaus would use the 2 bedrooms on the opposite side. The rain continued to fall, and cold night winds started beating the side of the house, but inside the 2 families were snug and warm. Aunt Catherine had made big bowls of thick vegetable soup for everyone, and Uncle Philippe picked out one of his choice bottles of wine to warm everyone's insides. Albert and Renee wrapped their hands around small metal goblets. Then everyone moved into the fire room and sang some of their favorite psalms, and both Father and Uncle Philippe prayed, giving thanks to God for his protection. Uncle Philippe had his daughter, Elizabeth, a very polite and quiet girl, play her violin, and the twins thought that these sounds were some of the most beautiful they had ever heard. Mary missed her flute that the dragoons had taken, but she too was overwhelmed by Elizabeth's violin playing. After a while, heavy eyelids began to droop, though it was still early. Guillaume nodded off once and fell off the bench, mumbling, "Hot." Abraham was exhausted and slowly nodded off, with Renee and Albert already snoring lightly as they leaned against his lap. Father and Mother carried and scooted their children off for a long, warm sleep.